So we're continuing on with our macroeconomic fundamentals, and the next one we're looking at is inflation. So inflation is an incredibly important macroeconomic variable in not only the Australian economy, but economies around the world. The idea is we like to keep the inflation rate low. We don't want a negative inflation rate, that is a disaster, and we don't want an inflation rate that is too high because that imposes a whole set of costs on the Australian economy. And I'll let you read about the costs of high inflation yourself in the textbook. So the first question I'm going to ask in this slide is, why does the average price level generally rise each year? Now, I am talking about the average price level, and I'm talking about prices of consumer goods only. So the inflation rate in Australia is measured by something called the Consumer Price Index, and that is an index of price levels over time of CPI is an index of the prices of a certain group of consumer goods and services. So we're not talking about the price in measuring the inflation rate. We're not talking about the prices of inputs into production. We're not talking about the prices of capital equipment, such as tractors and other sorts of capital equipment that I can't think of any other examples at the moment. We're talking about goods that consumers typically buy on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And of course, the prices of some goods do decline, and you can probably give me plenty of examples of goods that you buy that have declined in price over the last 2 or 3 or 4 years. But that's irrelevant to this. We're talking about the average price level of consumer goods, and that does rise every year, year after year. Now, some economies, of course, do experience deflation, which is a decrease in the average price level of consumer goods and services over the course of, say, a quarter or a year. That definitely happens, but it's quite rare. And in most economies, year after year, the price level on average does increase. And it's certainly happened in Australia for decades and decades. Every year, prices are slightly higher than they were the previous year. And we'll soon see that that's a beneficial feature of the Australian economy, having some positive amount of inflation. But the question that I want to get to is, why does the average price level generally rise each year? And this came out of, or this section of the slide came out of a question a friend of mine asked me a few months ago now. He was sort of looking at the goods and services that he was buying, and the example he used were the prices of fruit and vegetables. And he was sort of saying, well, today I go into a shop and I may want a kilo of oranges, and they'll cost me sort of $5 a kilo, as an example. But he said, 20 years ago, it used to cost me $1 a kilo. Why is it that, and he was totally perplexed. He was saying, why is it that every year things have got to get more and more expensive? Now, of course, your wages do go up to compensate you for that, but let's ignore that. Let's just think about where this inflation comes from year after year. And so the answer that I gave him was inflationary expectations. And it works this way. Assume that we are at the start of the year, so we're at January 1, and you are forming your expectation of what the inflation rate may be over the next 12 months. And let's assume that it's 5%. 5% is the number that you come up with for the inflation rate over the next 12 months. Now, why do you need to form an expectation of inflation? Because if you're running a small business, for example, then you'll need to know by how much to put your prices up at the start of the year so they keep pace with the prices of other goods and services. Because you don't want to just ignore this 5% inflation that's likely to come through, because then your revenue will fall. You might sell more because the prices are now relatively cheaper to that of your competitors, but your revenue is going to fall, your profit's going to fall. It's probably not going to be a good thing for your business. So if you're running a small business, you need an estimate of what the inflation rate will be so you can put the prices of your goods and services up by that amount at the start of the year. If you're a worker, you want to know what the inflation rate is so that you can ask for a 5%, as an example, a 5% inflation, sorry, a 5% increase in your nominal wage. If you're someone renting out capital, and capital, remember, could be factory space, it could be office space, it could be a tractor or a truck. If you're the owner of that sort of capital equipment and you're renting it out, you need to know how much to put those rents up by each year. So regardless of whether you're an owner of labour, an owner of capital, or the owner of a small business, and you control the prices of your own goods and services, you need an estimate of the inflation rate to know how much to put the wages or rents or the prices up by each year. And so your expectation, we're going to assume, is 5%. Where do you get that 5% expectation from? Well, let's just assume that the inflation rate last year was 5%, the year before that it was 5%, and the year before that it was 5%. So if that was the case, then your expectation of inflation is obvious. It's just what it was in previous years. Of course, in the real world, your expectation of inflation, that actual number, is going to be much more complex. There's going to be more factors that you incorporate into forming that expectation of inflation, but that's not what this course is about. We're just going to assume that, keep it nice and simple for now, and we're not interested in how expectations are formed. That's a little bit too complex for this course. We are more interested in the consequences of that inflation expectation. And let's just assume that it's 5%. Now, if it's 5% and you own a small business, then what you're going to do is put your prices up by 5%. So what's just happened is, through you expecting 5% inflation, you've pushed your prices up by 5%. And if you sell consumer goods and services, you've just created the 5% inflation that you expected. It's pretty much that simple. And so your revenues will go up by 5%, but your costs are likely to go up by 5% as well, which will then hopefully deliver you a 5% increase in profits, which will keep pace with all other prices going up by 5%. So if your profits go up by 5% and everything that you buy as an individual goes up by 5%, then it's going to keep you relatively constant in terms of your living standards. And your costs are going to go up by 5% because labour costs are going to go up by 5%, because if you're a worker, you're going to ask for a 5% increase in your money wage or nominal wage to keep your real wage or your expected real wage constant. And so that's going to increase labour costs. And the owners of capital are then going to increase their rents as well. So as we expect 5% inflation, prices rise by 5%, but then we've got costs increasing by 5% as well. So everything sort of stays relatively the same in a sense. So think of this expectation of inflation, which we've assumed to be 5%, as determining the underlying inflation rate. So if we went out tomorrow and we started expecting 2% inflation, we would get very close to 2% inflation simply because we expect it and we then behave in a way that creates the 2% inflation that we have expected. And then, of course, the actual inflation rate is going to fluctuate depending upon changes in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So imagine we start off at the intersection of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve in an at potential output. And at that point, the inflation rate is 5%. Of course, if the aggregate demand curve substantially shifts to the right, the actual inflation rate could turn out to be 7-8%. If the aggregate demand curve shifts substantially to the left, the actual inflation rate could turn out to be 2 or 3%. But 5% is kind of the baseline inflation rate under the expectation of 5% inflation. Now, obviously, the real world's more complicated than that, but that's a nice starting point at which to begin to understand how we get inflation each year. It's simply through inflationary expectations. And then what actually happens in the economy can result in the actual inflation rate being above or below the expected level of 5%. But then we've got the central bank will step in and adjust interest rates to try to take pressure off the inflation rate. We'll talk more about that soon. So that's why we get this average price level rising year after year after year, because we expect inflation, because we've had it in the past, and by having this expectation of inflation, wages rise by that level, rents rise by that level, and then prices ultimately rise by that level as well. Even if you are a business that didn't want to raise your prices by 5%, you'd almost be forced to, because your wages would be rising by 5%, your capital costs would be raising by 5%. So even if you're a business owner that didn't want to lift prices, you could only do that by suffering a loss, because your costs would be going up by 5% as well. So in a sense, you'd almost be forced to push your prices up by 5% when wages rise, capital and rent rates rise by 5%. Okay, so that's the process. But then another kind of related issue is something called inflation targeting. And in Australia, the Reserve Bank of Australia introduced inflation targeting in the early 1990s. Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia is extremely powerful. They oversee the other banks, they oversee the banking system, and they control interest rates in Australia. And they can raise the interest rates that you pay when you borrow money, and they can lower the interest rates you pay when you borrow money. Of course, if you're a saver and you're depositing money into your bank, and you've got money in a term deposit, the Reserve Bank will then control the interest rate that you receive on money that you have deposited in your bank account. So it's a very powerful organisation. And in the early 1990s, they introduced something called inflation targeting, which I've got there. And the target that they have set for the Australian economy is 2 to 3%. And now, right around the world, central banks have adopted inflation targeting. Now, the advantage of inflation targeting is that it controls inflationary expectations. So let's just imagine you're a business owner and you're wondering how much to put your prices up by at the beginning of the year, or you're a small business owner and your workers have asked for wage increases because they expect inflation, and you're trying to work out how much to increase their wages by at the start of the year. Or you own capital and you're trying to work out how much to put the rental rates of your capital up by. In this situation, with an inflation target in Australia of 2 to 3%, it's most likely that you will form an expectation of inflation somewhere between 2 and 3%. And it's quite interesting. A couple of years ago, I saw a document which was part of a negotiation between an organisation and the union that represented the workers that worked for that organisation. And it was late in the year, and they were trying to negotiate the nominal wage increase that the workers of that organisation would be paid in the following year. And the initial offer by the organisation was 2.5%. Now, this was only a few years ago. This inflation target was in place. And so it's quite interesting. The initial offer by the organisation was 2.5%. Where do you think they got that number from? They certainly didn't make it up. It was smack bang in the middle of this inflation target range set by the central bank. Now, of course, the unions probably would have been asking for more than 2.5%, but they wouldn't have asked for 4. They wouldn't have asked for 5, because it's just way out of line for the inflation target. So that's where the negotiation then takes place between the organisation and the union. I don't know what the final number was. It probably would have ended up pretty close to 2.5%, because that was the expected inflation rate over that year, because that's the inflation target of the central bank. So hopefully you can see the importance of this inflation target. This inflation target is known by individuals workers throughout the country, and it's known by organisations throughout the country. So, and because it's known, it controls inflationary expectations throughout the economy. And so unless we have some extraordinary event occurring, and we can talk about this later in the course, unless we have some extraordinary event occurring which creates massive inflationary pressure or massive deflationary pressure, in the absence of those extraordinary events, you'd expect most people to have an inflation expectation of around about 2.5%. And by doing that, you're controlling the rate at which businesses lift their prices. You're controlling the rate at which wages rise and rental rates on capital rise. And you're controlling costs, which then flow through and control the rate at which prices rise. So it's kind of almost circular. Control costs, you control prices. Control prices, you then control costs, the rate at which all of these things are increasing. So this inflation target, because it controls the rate of inflationary expectations, really does help deliver a low inflation rate. Because we expect 2.5% inflation, because of the target, we limit our wage demands, we limit our rent demands, and we don't push, as business owners, we don't excessively push up the prices of the final goods and services that we sell. And all of those responses to this inflation target help deliver a 2 to 3% inflation rate. So if we can control inflationary expectations through the target, we are 90% of the way towards delivering a low actual inflation rate. Okay, I say 90% of the way because sometimes in rare circumstances, you can have certain shocks to the economy, which can create a lot of inflation and drive the inflation rate above 3%, or create deflation and drive the inflation rate below 2%. But just for now, I'm talking about normal economic conditions. Normal economic conditions, the target set by the Reserve Bank will control your inflationary expectations, which will then control your wage demands, your rent demands, and the rate at which you put prices up if you're a business owner. So the inflation target controls the actual inflation rate. Next thing we have to do is look at why an inflation rate of 2 to 3% has been set by the central bank. Why haven't they set this target at 0%? There's very good reasons for that, but I will record another video to go through that final slide of the topic.